Hello and welcome to my presentation on Japanese Kabuki theater, a form of theater that has greatly impacted Japanese culture as well as the art of theater in general. I hope you enjoy and let's get right into it. So at first, as always, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I'll be talking about when regarding Kabuki theater, and first we'll dive into the theoretical context, so history, stage format, and all of that fun stuff. Then we'll talk about the performance conventions for the actors, a practical exploration where I'll also recommend some videos and books, and lastly a comparison to another form of Asian theater, Kathakali from India, and I'll talk about how it compares to Kabuki theater. And as always, you can find my resources in the end in the bibliography. So I hope you enjoy and thanks for watching. So I'll start off with a quote from a book I used a lot when researching for Kabuki theater, and the book was called Staging Japanese Theater, No and Kabuki. You can find it, of course, in my bibliography, and it was written by John D. Mitchell and Miyoko Watanabe. And before I talk about the quote, I'd like to just quickly say who the two authors of the book are. So John D. Mitchell, who this quote actually stems from, is the co-founder and the president of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Theater Arts and has made great contribution for various forms of international theater art. And Miyoko Watanabe was, I believe, Watanabe died in 2012, was a Kabuki dancer, actor, teacher, translator, and actor. And, oh, I said actor twice, sorry. And the stage name was Fujima Nishiki, after a national living treasure, and Miyoko Watanabe is considered to have made great contributions to Japanese Kabuki in general. So yeah, let's start with the quote. Kabuki is passionate, detailed, complex, ornate, and extroverted. Kabuki tends to permit greater activity, greater mobility, and greater participation on the part of actors and audience, which I believe is a great introduction and a great summary of Kabuki in general. So, as you can see there, the spelling in kanji of Kabuki. At first, it can be translated as meaning bizarre or absurd or out of the ordinary, which in and of itself characterizes Kabuki quite adequately, I'd say. But when you read the three symbols, the three kanji symbols next to Kabuki, starting from left to right, you can see the first one, sing, then you can see dance, and then skill, which are three main components. And you may ask yourself how dancing is an integral part of drama. Well, to be precise, Kabuki is a traditional Japanese dance drama and also a urban commercial theater as well as a theater of the people, meaning that throughout its presentation and throughout the history, it has been known for mixing the different social classes, something that was quite different when looking at the historical aspect of theater. And now I would also say that theater in general is something made for upper middle classes, upper classes, or generally it is perceived that way. It's a status symbol, and Kabuki broke through that barrier, bringing different social classes together. It's also very stylized and eccentric, as you can see on the little icon on this slide. It's a stylized simplification of the eccentric and elaborate makeup the performers wear. And it's eccentric all from its performance to the stage design to costumes, wigs, and makeup, and every single aspect of Kabuki can be considered eccentric, especially when compared to, for example, Shakespearean drama in the West. Moving on to the history and culture, as it is deeply rooted in the Japanese culture and history, we start with the year 1603 with Onna Kabuki. And Onna Kabuki means so much as women's Kabuki, and it's believed, according to legends, to be founded by, and by the way, I'm sorry for the pronunciations throughout this presentation. I'm not I'm not Japanese, I do not speak Japanese. I am trying my best and I apologize if I have incorrect pronunciations, but yes, as I said, I'm trying my best. So Izumo no Okuni was a shrine maiden that formed a female dance troupe in the riverbed of the Kamu River in Kyoto, and founded on a kabuki, which consisted of dancing and some choreographed skits meant for the entertainment of the people. And it was in general very suggestive and sexual in nature, and especially common in the red light districts of Kyoto, and to some extent was somewhat of a advertisement of prostitution or a gateway to prostitution. And because of that, contemporary military dictatorships, the so-called shogunate, banned it in 1629 for being too suggestive for the general public, as well as because it facilitated the meddling of social classes. You had the simple merchants and simple people of Kyoto mixing in with samurai classes and upper classes, ruling classes when watching kabuki, as it was theater of the people. And that, of course, was perceived as tarnishing the upper classes, which was something they wanted to avoid, so they banned it. Which was not that, well, it wasn't that effective because that year Wakasho Kabuki emerged. And they had banned women's kabuki, which meant that men, or rather young boys, now took over the theater scene. And these young boys were also mostly prostitutes, so the same problem arose with the suggestive nature. So again, it was banned shortly after, around 1652, or even sooner than that, I believe. Afterwards, Yaro Kabuki arose, which is kind of the skeleton form of kabuki that developed afterwards. So it was adult men playing all of the roles as, young men, and women were now forbidden to perform. And they also took great care that the plays were not suggestive in nature, and that the costumes and wigs and makeup were not suggestive in nature to avoid the aforementioned problems. Now, we have throughout the Yaro Kabuki time the golden age, the considered golden age of kabuki, namely the Genroku period, from the 1673 to 1841, where the main characteristics developed. And there was also the first official or professional kabuki playwright, Chikamatsu Monzaemon, who wrote the classics of the kabuki repertoire. And if you are now to see a kabuki play, it is most likely that it is at least based on some of his works. Something that is not shown in this timeline is the Saruwaka Cho Kabuki period from 1842 to 1868, where the performance of kabuki was again hindered, once through natural conditions and natural disasters such as extreme droughts that I think burned down a lot of the stages kabuki was performed on. And also there were again issues with the shogunate that forced kabuki underground, and primarily in the place of Asakusa. This changed when the restoration of Emperor Meiji took place in 1868, which was also the beginning of the Meiji era, with the openings of kabuki and the development of kabuki that re-emerged again and, formed again the main characteristics of kabuki and further developed it. And that was because of extreme cultural changes. There was no military dictatorship as before, at least no shogunate of the Tokugawa, as well as that the fact that there were no more samurai classes. And an additional factor was the globalization, especially to the West, which gave kabuki a rise and an emergence in international theater. And although this did not happen until later, the complete globalization, let's call it that, a lot of artists in the West were actually inspired by the artistic forms of Kabuki, because I believe even the artist Claude Monet was inspired in some of his works, as were many others. Now, there was a short ban of Kabuki after the Second World War until 1947, which was, but afterwards, taken down again, and stronger connections to the West were made, as we can see here, in the 1960s in the USA. And it did not only have greater connections to the West, but also formed some of the foundations of pop culture in general and idols in Japan and internationally, as it was one of the first forms of, let's call it, celebrity culture, as we might see it now with film stars and so on. The same kind of energy was brought onto Kabuki actors, something unique as well. It was also formed to be of the UNESCO World Heritage in the year 2005, and also gains with the years more recognition, especially in Japanese culture, but also in other ones. I believe in the States they also made Shakespearean dramas in a Kabuki style and so on, and in Japan there were also many anime, for example, other series based on that. Now, enough with the culture, with the history, I should say. We'll move on to the different types of Kabuki. And first we have the Shosagoto, the dance Kabuki, which is actually the origin of Kabuki, because as you remember, the Onna Kabuki, the Izumi, started as a dance troupe. And although the story was not in the foreground, this dance Kabuki was actually integrated in almost all of the other forms of Kabuki, so it's still an integral part of Kabuki, implemented in modern plays. Then we have historical Kabuki, Jidaimono, that is based on historical events and tells stories of the samurais and wars and so on. We also have domestic Kabuki, called Sewamono, that presents real events but in a dramatized and a stylized way. And most importantly, or most prevalently, we have tragic love stories and love suicides. And these love suicides, if you can imagine Romeo and Juliet in wigs and costumes and makeup screaming in Japanese, that is to some extent what you might imagine under Sewamono Kabuki. And this first playwright I mentioned, Chikamatsu Monzaemon, was actually the first one that set the trope for love suicides to such an extent that it's now an important part of the genre. And you know, the play structure in and of itself actually greatly resembles the traditional Freitag pyramid. So we have a 5-act structure of exposition, plot, climax, catastrophe, and epilogue, but it extends itself throughout many hours, and some of the more traditional Kabuki plays actually, together with the pauses and the recessions in between, last an entire day. Moving on to the stage design, which is something very important and unique and innovative in Kabuki. We have on the left an infographic from the book I mentioned at the start, and then on the right a picture or a painting of a Kabuki stage. And it's very interesting because it has many technical aspects that are very innovative and very technical even for that time when they emerged. So at first we have a turntable, a Mawari butai, that allows, it's basically a circle, you know what a turntable is, but it's a circle that can rotate and turn over, that allows for very dynamic and quick scenes changes. And if you have been paying attention, Kabuki is very dynamic in everything that encapsulates it. Then we have also trapdoors for dramatic exits or entrances and so on. So here in 2, 3, and 7 we see the seri. Then we have a music box in the 4 that's also there for sound effects, and there are very characteristic sound effects with many different instruments that are presented in Kabuki that not only consist of, instruments but also of voices. If you can look it up on YouTube, it's a very interesting watch to see the traditional sound effects that are used throughout. In number 5 we have a narrator's box, for the narrator, duh. And in number 6 we have something, the hanamichi, which is very characteristic and typical for Kabuki. That's where the very, very dramatic entrances happen, and because of that the seats next to the hanamichi are very thought about, because of the idealization of the actor, and it takes them several minutes to cross that hanamichi because of the performance. There are also in number 8 a waiting room for the characters, or rather the actors that wait to come on to stage without a dramatic entrance. And in number 9 we have a substage walkway that is not as important as the hanamichi but still allow for great involvement of the audience. Now we come to the Kabuki actors, the most integral and primary emphasis of Kabuki. Most of them are considered living national treasure, and they go through lifelong training starting off as children. And there's this very interesting culture of proteges where young men are being tutored by, the Kabuki actors from a very young age. And it is not, of course, for the dancing and for the acting, it's a very technical process, but this protege culture consists mostly of the observation of the professional actors in order to then assume your own form of acting. And method acting is a very integral part of Kabuki acting, as there are several character types. For example, the onagata, the woman that men then portray, and the very successful Kabuki actors actually in their day-to-day life assume these more stereotypically female behaviors in order to portray them accurately on stage. And there are these Kabuki families that have been in the business for generations and are considered living national treasures. So there is this elite form amongst actors, so not everybody can just say that they'd like to be a Kabuki actor and start out with that. There's this very integral culture behind it. And it's also said that Kabuki is 80% physical and 20% vocal training. So in general, a lot of training. And a very successful, I believe, onagata actor, Baiko, said in the book I mentioned at the start, the heart that goes into the acting remains the same. If you are just presenting a form with no feeling, no heart, you're just a doll. And that's an adequate statement for all acting, I believe, but it also shows the integral part of, for example, method acting that goes into Kabuki. Then we have something characteristic, very characteristic of Kabuki, which is the keisho, or the kumadori, the face paint or the makeup that the characters, the actors are wearing. And they're there for identification of characters. For example, certain colors represent certain characters. And they're also there to present social classes. For example, the higher classes, the higher social classes, would wear pure white painting, as in return, for example, if you are presenting a character of a poorer social standing, you'd use more yellowish, brownish tone, which is also representative of the culture and the makeup in general throughout the history of Japan. And they have a very artistic and spiritual aspect, so the actors themselves actually put on their own makeup, which is different to most theater performances I know of, and it's a form of spiritually getting into character. The effects that the keisho assumes are also enhanced by costumes, elaborate costumes and wigs, and there's also even a specific form of Kabuki that centers all around wigs, and there are these mostly, for example, red wigs that are then spun around and are more that are several meters long. There we have certain, kumadori and well, kumadori is mostly used for the warrior type makeup, the one you see on the right, and then you have the female kabuki character, the onagata, on the left. And there are many other main character tropes. For example, the oni, the demon, with blue face paint, and in Sewa Monoplace we have the protagonist and the love interest. But if you are interested in that, I would greatly suggest that you do research, because it's a very interesting process to witness. We have also a performance convention that's important and focused on movement, the mie, which is a series of close-ups. If you could imagine, it's a live still image and a live zoom image. It's been characterized as an action crystallizing self-contained dramatic pose, and that basically summarizes it. The actor stands still, looks mostly with eyes crossed at the audience, and does a series of movements that are representative of the character and of the situation that the character finds themselves in. It's mostly at the climax of the plot, so it's used sparingly and effectively, and it's also emphasized by music. And you also have, for example, a kakegoi, a scream from an expert audience members, because there are expert audience members that know when exactly to scream in a certain way to emphasize a specific action or occurrence throughout the play. Throughout the practical exploration, J.D. Mitchell also said that the actor develops into a mature actor over a period of years through observation, imitation, and identification. And I also like that quote because it says a lot about acting and performance in general, and is divided into three steps of the passive observation, and then the copying of said observation, and you then take what you have learned and turn it into something you yourself have evolved and have thought about and have developed throughout your observations and imitations. Here I would have presented a video, but you can watch it on YouTube. I've put the link in the descriptions if you're interested. It's a few hours long, but it's quite interesting to watch. It's Yoshitsune and the Thousand Cherry Trees. It's one of the three most popular kabuki plays, written in 1747, and it definitely shows most of the characteristic of kabuki I've already talked about, and it's in general a very interesting watch. Now, coming to the comparison with katakali, I'll just go really shortly over the characteristics of katakali, because that is an entirely different video in and of itself. But it's also dance theater stemming from India. It's also very stylized, as you can see on the picture here on the right. It's also performed by males, and it's also shown through elaborate makeup, the vesha. A difference of that could be comparable to, for example, through mies, is the mudras and the navarasas. And the mudras are, I think, the movements, the specific movements with the hands and the hand gestures, whereas the navarasas were the specific facial expressions that could be very reflective of the mie. And they also rely a lot on the narrator. There is little to no dialogue when performing katakali, and it's mostly done through the narrator and the performance of the actor, the non-verbal performance of the actor, which I think is very interesting because it shows the importance of non-verbal acting as opposed to simply dialogue-based acting. And as you can see, it's quite similar in its foundations to kabuki, but when you look at it, they both have been greatly impacted by the culture that they have been developed in. A quote I found on that specific topic between kabuki and katakali is that kabuki is more theater art in this aspect, with property, scene, and dynamic change of place. Katakali remains a journey in the mind, where the dancer takes the audience forward in the might of his performance alone. And both of the theater forms are very interesting and provide an alternative to, for example, Shakespearean theater, and also involve a different kind of culture towards the audience, and both have had a great impact on the theater as an art form in general, and it has been actually very interesting to look at different forms of theater throughout my research. And I thank you, after all, for listening and for spending time with this video. I hope it was to some extent helpful, maybe informative, educational, I don't know. I just thank you for listening. These are my sources. If you like, you can stop this and screenshot them if you need any of them. And I hope you have a nice day. Take care.